Hello, friends. This is the Alphalist podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the Alphalist podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for the company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the Alphalist podcast. I am your host, Toby, and today with me is Rebecca Murphey, and Rebecca Murphy is the field CTO of a company called Swarmia. She wrote a book about engineering effectiveness called Build, and what Swarmia does is basically reporting on engineering effectiveness.
Yes. Yeah, we're kind of a platform for people at all levels of engineering organization to kind of understand how work is flowing through the organization and what people are working on and how much time is taking and are they working on the right thing and are there bottlenecks getting in the way of them getting their best work done as fast as possible. So really a tool for, like I said, all levels of the engineering organization. Even CFOs are getting in on the fun lately. So
okay, I can imagine that this is a tool for CFOs. I can
mostly for engineering leaders, but yeah, we're talking to more and more CFOs with some of the things that we're building.
And before you started off at Swarmia, you led developer productivity efforts at Stripe and beforehand at Indeed. So you know the field, right?
Yes, I will not. So there were leaders above me who ran all things developer productivity, but both at Indeed and at Stripe, I was very involved and invested in the developer productivity organization and ran my own teams within that organization. So that was true at both. At Indeed, I built a team from scratch, and from Stripe, I also kind of built a team from scratch focused around front end productivity, productivity for front end development. But the more I got into it, like I grew up as a front end engineer, but the more I got into this productivity stuff, like the stack, where you are in the stack really doesn't matter. It's just kind of fascinating all the way down.
I also like that field a lot. I mean, it's kind of trending these days, especially in the remote world, right? I had a podcast before with AB Noda, for example, from UX.
Yep.
Get DX, which is a different approach, which I think you also have some edges in, right, through etc.
Yeah, there's definitely several entrants in this field right now. Some of them have been around for a really long time, and I have to be reminded that some folks have been doing this for quite a while, but they're also some of their approaches are equally dated. But yeah, we have lots of competitive friends in the space, and I think we're all just kind of exploring what does it take to make an effective organization? And there's a lot of moving pieces. So DX has gone really heavy on the surveys. We were also really invested in surveys. There's other products like Jellyfish that are very, very focused on the kind of FinOps angle of all of this and less on the, helping actual developers be more productive. So range of entrants in this. And I think and hope that we are all learning from each other pretty constantly.
And one more detail. I'm also invested in a company called Waydev. I don't know.
Yep. Oh, if you want me to list all of our competitors, no, it's a long list. I think that's really emblematic of this becoming a focal point for engineering leaders and just engineering organizations and organizations that build software. This in the 2010s and early 2020s, money was free. You could pretend that you were solving a lot of productivity problems just by adding more people, and adding people was relatively cheap. Now you're seeing the layoffs happen. You're seeing companies get a lot more a lot more cautious and conservative about hiring, and they're trying to figure out, like, how do we, like, where are the efficiencies that we could realize with the people that we already have.
Mhm.
And I think, again, this is very much a moment in time. As interest rates went up, interest in this went up as well, because it's a lot more pressing to figure out how to get the most out of the folks that you have.
And now where interest rates go down again, like, does your business trend down again, or?
I don't know. Like, I think that until interest rates get to zero again, no. Like, I think that there really was a phenomenon called zero interest rates, and so ZIRP and the post-ZIRP era we like to talk about. No, I don't. I think until or unless rates go back down to zero, which I don't really foresee happening. In the we'll get back down to sane rates, but maybe not zero. And I also think that just as the software industry matures, these questions become more top of mind as well. You have more. There are more and more software companies that have been around for a decade or longer now, and they are also trying to figure out, like, how do we keep sustaining our revenue while maybe, like, not having to support as much costs on the operational side.
I think it's also not so much about, like, not necessarily only about costs, and I don't know, optimizing on savings, right? But also about teams becoming more effective and showing folks, like, the blind spots in their stack, right? Like, I mean, there's also a trend through, like, things getting more and more complex. A trend against that like goes back to simplicity, and then it's often about, like, collaboration, like, and how quick can you deploy, right? How much is your, like, how often do you have to go smoking because
you're waiting for the build, right?
Yeah. I think that also is important to mention there, right? I think that's even the most important thing, that if your folks are frustrated, then this leads.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I really like about, and I don't want to talk about Swarmia for the whole podcast, but one of the things I really do like about Swarmia as a tool is that I was just talking to one of our reps about how Swarmia really provides accountability up and down, and provides visibility up and down. So one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is how leaders in an engineering organization, how their actions can improve or hurt productivity. And so it gives them visibility into how their actions are, if there's a lot of interrupt driven work, or if there's a lot of constantly changing priorities, gives them visibility into how that's affecting things too. So I think overall, this is just, the industry is at a stage, and interest rates were kind of a forcing function to make us take this a little bit more, like, to try to arrive at an objective evaluation of how software engineering organizations are doing. That's, for whatever reason, seemed less important in the 2010s, because, again, money was free, growth was happening. Not a lot of questions were being asked about, like, are these 5 people working on the right thing? Was this a good investment to create this team? We weren't necessarily asking those questions in the past, and now those sorts of questions, I think, again, like I said, interest rates were a forcing function, but the overall maturity of the industry has kind of pushed us toward asking questions that maybe we skipped over a few years ago.
I also think that there was this late realization how much complexity went up, right? And also, like, massive orgs actually pushing for very complex solutions. And now people realize, hey, with my small team, I heavily build depth, I heavily build legacy, and I have to get back to zero, or at least to like a greener field than this brown field that I have, right?
Right. And I think there's been a lot of push too, to be able to, quantify, what if we did make this better? What does better look like? How much does better improve the bottom line for the business? How does better improve business outcomes? And that's something we talk a lot about too, is how we talk about productivity and we talk about developer experience, but a missing part of this conversation in the earlier years, I think, was, like, are we actually working on the right thing? Like, we can work really fast on the wrong thing. But are we actually working on the thing that the business values? And so I think that's a really key part of the productivity conversation that maybe has been missing in the past is, are we doing the right things? Are we, when we started this project, we thought it was going to take 5 devs 3 months to do this. It's 5 devs and 3/4 later. Are we still cool with that? Like, is that still? And again, in the past, you might have just let that go. You might have just let that run. Now I think there's a lot more like, we can't let that happen. We can't let projects run indefinitely. We need to be more mindful of where we're spending our time, and is it on something that the business that is delivering value to the business.
So outcome focus.
Outcomes, yes, outcome. But I also, I'm writing a blog post about this right now, and I also want to point out that, like, when we say we've got to make sure we're working on things that are valuable to the business, that doesn't mean we never work on KTLO. That doesn't mean we never work on writing automated tests. It just means that we need to be making clear to the business why these things are valuable to the business. And so, yeah, I don't want to make this sound like, we're going back to the assembly line and, just work until we tell you you're done. We're definitely wanting to kind of help businesses and teams understand and communicate the value that they're providing to the business.
Mm-hmm. And do you have tips, like concrete tips on how to better communicate the value? I mean, obviously through using your tool. Apart from that, like, any things that you saw in companies working quite well?
So, I think my this isn't like a TLDR answer. I'm sorry, but like my best advice is to read. There's this really great book called Principles of Product Development Flow by Reinert. I never remember exactly the order of the letters of his name. I think it's Reinertson, and it really does talk about these kind of like the consequences of prioritization decisions. I think it talks about that quite a bit. I think also one of the things I've come to realize through working at Swarmia, I knew it, but it's like much clearer in my head now, is that this whole productivity conversation and throughput conversation, whatever you want to call it, it's kind of boils down to just queuing theory, which is a field of mathematics that we can like make provable statements about. And so realizing that when you, so as far as making a business case, you can explain that when you have a queue that has, I'm not necessarily talking about testing, but let's talk about like work in progress limits. When you have a queue and the workers are running constantly hot, where every worker has to be working on 3 things at once, well, that queue is not going to behave very well. And work is going to get lost, and work is going to get dropped, and workers are going to become overworked and like fall offline and have to be restarted. So when you think about this work as, ultimately you are moving a set of and of course engineering is way more creative than this. I don't mean to like reduce engineering to a queue, but when you think about stuff like how work moves through a queue, and how you don't want to have vastly different sized work moving through the queue, and you don't want to stop a worker midway through working a work item and tell them to work on something else, when you start to think about it like that, then it starts to become really obvious that so testing is a task that a worker could work on from a queue, right? Like, we need to test, does this thing work? When we do that manually, you have that create like incredible batch size variation, right? Like, testing this thing takes 2 minutes, but testing this thing takes 2 hours. And then maybe we feel like we need to test the whole app to make sure it all still works manually. Well, you can see how like a queue that is working those kinds of tasks is going to be less efficient than a queue that is like, let me run these tests and see if it works. Let me run these tests and see if it works again. Let me run these tests and see if it, like a worker working a queue where the task is like, do this thing over and over and over again is going to be way more efficient than a queue being served by a human worker that has to kind of create the task every time from scratch. So when you start to think about how work moves through the system, and again, there's lots of creative parts of software engineering that I don't want to like. It's still really cool to get in a room and like work on a whiteboard with your friends on how something's going to work. But ultimately, when it comes down to doing the work, there are, again, like kind of mathematically true things that we can say about how a system will behave depending on the size of the tasks, the consistency of the tasks, the utilization of the workers. Like we can actually make mathematical statements about this. And so I think that's where you start to, going back to your original question, how do we make the case that this is good for the business? With math, I think is my answer. So, and I think you can even apply that to KTLO, because KTLO, again, causes variability in the size of the task, or being able to predict the size of a task. And that, again, is going to make a worker less efficient. I'm using worker in a computer sense, not in a human sense, but same thing. Like when KTL increases in the uncertainty of any given task, that means it creates uncertainty in the size of the task. And when we have uncertainty in the size of the task, that leads to inefficient processing of the queue.
And like hard to imagine, but how do you? I don't know. How do you explain that to folks out there? How do you show that in your tool? Is it like the only thing you do? I mean, there's like certain approaches, right? There's DORA, there's space, there's DX. Do you combine that all in an ideal setup these days, or what like how does, from your perspective, the ideal setup look like for the folks out there?
Yeah. So in Swarmia, actually, like it's much more grounded in reality instead of theory, right? So in Swarmia, you can go and you can see that you can see how work is moving through the system, and you can sort of see that like big tasks move through the system differently than small tasks. For example, in our work log, or when you're looking at cycle time metrics for individual issues, you can kind of see those differences. One of the things I'm hoping we work on over the next, fairly long period of time is bringing more of this kind of more of this visibility into like, if you do this, then this will happen. And we have some of that in the product already, kind of around like just planning and forecasting. But I've been Claude and I are best friends lately, Claude AI and I, and so Claude and I had a whole chat about this the other night, trying to kind of visualize some of the things that I'm saying. So Claude built me a little React app with sliders and stuff. And so definitely thinking more about how to visualize this to stakeholders, because it really does. There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of details, but it really does boil down to, if you can make the size of the work predictable and similar, and then good things happen. But in order to make the work predictable and similar, you have to have those tests, you have to have like a decent architecture to work in, et cetera, et cetera. So those concepts aren't necessarily visible in Swarmia quite yet, but it's something that I'm really eager to bring to the product to help leaders understand the impact of their choices.
Which then is DORA, or? So
we talk about DORA. So DORA, the DevOps Research Assessment metrics. There's 4 metrics that I always get wrong. So lead time to change failure rate, mean time to recovery, and something else that I always forget. But so the DORA metrics are really about how a team is operating. Like when a team has a piece of work, how does it move through the system? And being able to see that, like this team has a cycle time of 10 days. Oh, that's because they're really bad at reviewing each other's pull requests. So we need to work on that. So Swarmia really helps you recognize those sorts of issues around DORA metrics, using DORA metrics. We also do get into space, which really talks about how this concept of productivity and engineering effectiveness is much more holistic than just looking at stats from Git and Jira and maybe your deployment pipeline. That it involves like, are we working on the right things? That's the P in space. I forget what the P stands for too, but it is the P in space. It's basically like, are we working on the right things? Did we have the right, like, did the outcomes that we wanted happen? But it also looks at stuff like satisfaction, like, are our developers engaged and do they feel empowered to do their best work? And are there things getting in their way? But the space also looks at like communication, collaboration, and efficiency and flow. And I love it. And I do think like Swarmia does surface a lot of many of these things throughout the tool. Just again, kind of give an engineering organization an idea of like, how are they doing and how is work moving through the system. But as far as this like, if you like listened to the Q theory talk and adjusted your whole engineering workflow accordingly, then yeah, you would expect to see cycle times that are very low, and you'd expect to see mean times to recovery that are very low, and you'd expect to see satisfaction be very high, because it's a lot easier to work in the code base and to work on small things rather than big ones. So I think you would see across these sort of different frameworks that we have for measuring air quotes productivity, I think you would, if you implemented some of these best practices of small batch sizes, limiting work in progress, finish what you start, which again are all kind of based in queuing theory. If you focus on some of those things, then you should see across the board improvements in all of these, in the metrics from all of these frameworks. The challenge, I think, often is that like limiting work in progress is hard. And it's something that an individual team may not have a lot of agency over, unless they have a really strong leader who feels safe saying no to things. And so a lot of these things are really easy to talk about, but they can be really cultural changes required for an organization to start working on small things instead of big things, and start working on automated tests, and start working on limiting work in progress. That can be really hard if that hasn't been how a team has worked before.
Mm-hmm. I imagine also that the actionability of those metrics really depends on the case a lot, right? I mean, in many companies I know, like the cycle time is just like wasted by very long deployments that like no one takes care of to optimize that. Then you just mentioned like the number of issues or number of topics in progress is obviously a factor. Like there's no single view or no single recommendation you give to companies, right? It's really hard to also plug in all those data sources sounds like a horrible amount of work.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of our build versus buy pitch, is that staying on top of integrating with all of these tools and their latest features and their API breaks and all that. Like that is kind of a foundational value that we offer, is just, we did that hard stuff for you. But beyond that, yeah, you're really like reliving my morning right now, because I had a conversation with one of our product managers talking about how we could surface actionability to people based on survey results or whatever. And it really is this like, it depends. I need to know so much. Like, why haven't you written automated tests? I need to know that to tell you like how to start. I need to know what the cultural aspects have, what the cultural influences have been to mean that you haven't been writing automated tests, and that you do have really high work in progress. Because like I said, if your cycle time is high, it could be because you have really bad pull request hygiene. And you have a bunch of developers who are working in their own silo and never want to be bothered to review somebody else's pull request. Well, that's this problem we can solve inside the team, right? Mm-hmm. We can say, stop doing that. And in Swarmia, we can put in working agreements to say, like, we agree that we're going to stop doing that. And then Swarmia will call you out whenever you.
Which is like a version retro, right? Version retro. Hey, we stopped doing that. We all agree on that, and then you have that version, and then you can cycling through. Yes. You can optimize and optimize and optimize.
But what I want to say, though, is that, so that's one reason cycle time could be problematic. Cycle time could also be problematic because the team has an incident every other day, and they're not being given the time to do the KTLO work to reduce those incidents. And that's not within their control. Like that requires a conversation with outside stakeholders to be like, you're not going to get any work out of us until you give us the time to fix these things, or we're not going to be predictable. You'll get work, but it's going to be very unpredictable until you give us the time to fix these things. So I talk about DORA metrics as being about the team, but sometimes it's not in the team's agency to do, like they're going to need help from above or beside or somewhere in order to actually move those numbers.
Yeah. How do leaders influence productivity in software organizations? I mean, you just mentioned like, hey, you have to learn saying no. That's one of the first things you learn if you start as a manager or leader in the software field. But what else? Like, do you see, like, do you know certain smells that you can talk about publicly, or?
So I think a great example is, and this is not. This is something I did experience, but it's not unique to any one company, is the CEO who wants a report on their desk every 2 weeks about, how something is going, how a project is going, how an initiative is going, how whatever. The CEO, like, of course they want that, and that's a very reasonable thing for them to want, but they don't realize that producing that report to the level of detail that they want every 2 weeks is actually taking half of an engineer.
Yeah.
All the time. And so there's stuff like that where you want something, but you don't realize what the cost of that thing is. There's also the case, and I've talked to engineering leaders where it's like, I didn't realize that if I said something was interesting, that people were going to go off and spend 2 weeks on it. Like, that wasn't my goal. I didn't mean for them to spend any time on it. It was just an idle conversation. But leaders often need to realize that they can't have idle conversations about potential work without being really clear about their intentions about whether that work should get done or not. It's really fun to talk about, wouldn't it be cool if our product could? But that can lead to ambitious engineers going and being like, I'm going to go do that to make my VP happy.
Yeah.
So I think there's that sort of stuff, but there's also, just giving the air cover to say, like, you can't have all of these things. And if you try to have all of these things, you're going to end up with none of them, or you're going to end up with all of them in a year instead of one of them in a month. And so I think just, again, I go back to the principles of product development flow, understanding how work flows and how you can disrupt work. I think is a really essential skill for a leader these days. And maybe it wasn't before, because you could always hire more bodies to, do that thing that you wanted. So I think that's one failure mode, is just like the executive who doesn't realize their power and realize the cost that power is imposing. But I think there's also, another pathology is just, we have, like I said, we have incidents all the time, and product is like breathing down our neck to get that thing done, or sales is breathing down our neck to get that thing done. Well, we have incidents all the time. Like, a leader is going to need to figure out is going to need to help the team navigate that in the best interest of the business. And may need to say to the product people, like, or the sales people, like, sorry, we screwed up when we said we could do this. We can't do this. And in fact, we can't do anything for you for a while until we get this under control. And that's a really hard thing for a leader to say, right? To say, no, I'm not going to do that for you, and I can't do that for you for the next 3 months either. But in the interest of a sustainable business, you have to be able to kind of balance those short-term desires with the long-term needs. If you just keep building features, and never address the kind of baggage that you're creating while you're doing that, you will get to a point where all delivery is unpredictable until you invest.
Until you invest into fighting debt, right?
Yeah.
Do you have like a good strategy in mind to do that, or a good ratio in mind of like how much time is typically or should be typically spent on fighting debt versus building new features?
It definitely matters on where you are, right? When you're a four-person engineering team at a startup, we don't care about debt. And like, at Swarmia, we've been really, one of the things that I think we've done really intelligently was hiring not hiring the cheapest engineers we could find, but the best engineers we could afford, so that we could give those 4 engineers, they were unlikely to create unnecessary debt because of their level of experience. But still, at a small size, like, don't worry, like, that's not your problem until you have product market fit, right? Like, not the thing to focus on. But there comes a time where you have product market fit, or like at least one team is fairly stable. Maybe some of your teams are a little bit less stable, but one team is stable. And then that's the time that I think you look at, like, all right, how much time are we spending on new feature development? How much time are we spending on improving existing features? How much time are we spending on kind of keep the lights on, which includes interrupt-driven work like incidents? And then how much time are we spending on just improving our own situation proactively, like writing tests, for example? So, and what we kind of recommend is that, and again, depending on where you are in your journey, you probably always want to be spending 10% on 10% or so on productivity and 20% or so on KTLO, except for maybe that really, really early stage. And then how you split up your new features versus existing features is kind of up to product. But the idea is that an engineering team is kind of holding back 30% of their time for work that product doesn't get to prioritize. But again, if you are in a, like, we have 3 incidents a week, that KTLO number might need to go up to like 70 for a little while just to get that under control. And that's a really hard, I don't have any good advice for how to make that message any easier to hear. It really is a question of, like, do you want to hit this quarter's goals, or do you want to have a sustainable business in 2 years? It's a constant balance between those.
Many people want to have a mix of both, right? But
right. I think understanding that those 2 things are in tension, and that when you are just optimizing for the quarter, you are de-optimizing for the future. And get, like you said, those need to be in balance. Like, you can't do one or the other. But those 2 things need to be in balance so that you are continuing to create a sustainable environment for creating more value, right? And that's what you want, is an environment where you can keep creating value. And if you are only creating value and not gardening the environment, then eventually you will not have an environment where you can create value.
Understood. Getting back to, like, where it all started, and basically, like, the idea of, I don't know, spying on folks in Git histories, right? I mean, that's how basically that's the basic concept of DORA.
That is absolutely the worst way that you could put it, but yes, not entirely invalid.
Also not really accepted by the developers itself. It's
right.
really hard to sell to your team. But is there anything in there, like if you just look at the early concepts, that really works? Like, I don't know. I every once in a while ask myself, like, hey, if like, I don't know, 10% of your team didn't commit anything for a month and it's purely engineers, is that a bad smell? Like, is that something you should observe as a leader, or is it a red flag if someone really looks at commits and really, yeah?
So yeah, and this is kind of like the perennial question around productivity and effectiveness, is like, are you spying on me? And I mean, objectively, we are collecting data from GitHub and Jira, and you as the engineer are contributing that data that we are then ingesting. So, like, yes, that is happening. We have a record of every single one of your commits, just like Git has, right? Like, that's one thing to remember, is all this information exists. If you want to write a shell script to go, like, process your Git log for the last 2 years and try and pull some DORA metrics out of it, you probably can. Right? So all of this data exists. There's no new spying that's happening. There's just, like, we are making this data more accessible to people to make better decisions. That said, that's probably not enough to make a developer feel good. That like we're just making it easier to spy on you. What we found at Swarmia, so right after I joined, we were working on this feature called Developer Overview that really was going to show at an individual developer level what you were working on, like how often you were working on it, who you were working with, all these things, and we really, really hemmed and hawed about how we were going to release. This was something that like a customer wanted. We were like, should we just turn this on for the customer? Should we turn this on for everybody? How are we going to explain this to developers? Because we've been trying to really be a really developer friendly product. We turned it on. We turned it on for everyone except anyone who wanted it turned off. And developers really liked it because it was letting them have, like, they didn't have to go write the shell script, scrape the Git log to figure out what did I work on this quarter. They didn't have to go like analyze individual Jira tickets to figure out, am I like the one person on the team that's doing all the KTLO? Or to realize like, I'm the only person on the team who worked on this part of the code base all quarter. And like either the engineer could realize like I'm a bus factor there, or the manager could realize there's a bus factor here and we need to do something about it. So we really, and we can only do so much. We really, number one, we really emphasize that DORA metrics are about the team. You cannot look at the cycle time of a developer because a developer is not solely like they don't have sole agency over how long it takes for their thing to move through the system. Mm-hmm. They depend on their teammates. They depend on CI. Sure. They depend on like so many things, right? So we really emphasize that DORA metrics aren't about the individual. They can really only be about the team because it's a team effort to deliver value. Sure. But looking at it and what's that?
But lines of code.
I mean, yeah, like we all know that we can game lines of code. We can game all of these things. And that was something. So when I was at Indeed and we were working on a productivity initiative, one of the things that I said to my boss at the time was like, aren't we just going to see people, because of the things that we were optimizing for, aren't we just going to see people making more and smaller pull requests? And he was like, yes. And that's great. So I think there's some amount of lines of code is a bad thing to game, but there are things that you might want to game, like the size of pull requests, and other things like that. So, but going back to the developer overview, what we really found is that it became, in the best case, when you have this data available to you, it's actually a tool for you to be able to have good conversations with your manager about what you want to be working on, what you're working on too much, what you're not working on enough, who you're working with, those sorts of things. And so it turns out to be a pretty powerful tool for review time, which wasn't necessarily our intent, for both the manager and the individual. But I think my more meta take on this is, and this may make me really unpopular, I don't know. My more meta take on this is like, sales has been measured forever. Customer service has been measured forever. Finance has been measured forever. We aren't that special. Like, now I grant you that this is not an assembly line, that we need to stay away from like thinking that this is an assembly line, but neither is sales and neither is customer support. But we've been measuring those things. I don't say we should bring the same kinds of measurements, but that it shouldn't be considered just like completely irrational to think that we need to figure out how to measure the value that we're getting for one of the biggest spends in the company. So engineers are usually, let's see, cloud and engineers. One of those is the first and one of those is the second biggest cost that the company tends to have. So I think there's some amount of engineers being a little precious about their specialness that I think is not going to survive the 2020s, because I think that the reality is that capitalism is going to drive us to want to optimize these things. And lucky engineers are now part of that optimization.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, not every engineer would most likely see it like that, but yeah.
Well, I remember I hired somebody once, and they really, 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 really wanted to spend a whole lot of time cleaning up the CSS for our flagship product. And I had to remind them, like, that you need to tell me what benefit that has to the business. And I'm not saying there isn't one, but like, what benefit, like, if you spend 3 months doing that, what's better when you're done? Like, we don't get paid for writing good CSS. That's not, and I think that's the thing that engineers kind of, especially junior engineers, kind of have to reckon with, is like, they think they're paid to write code, but they're actually paid to create value for the business.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's kind of an awakening that people are having right now too. That's sometimes a little uncomfortable.
Now we know what engineers often get wrong, but what do you think are like what do CTOs do get wrong often? Like what are the common mistakes that CTOs make, and how can we address them?
Yeah. I think the biggest, I don't want to call it a mistake, but I think one of the biggest skills CTOs need to have is the ability to explain to their non-technical peers um, how engineering works at a level that is appropriate for those non-technical peers. It's not enough anymore to just say, "Trust me, I got it under control. You'll get everything you want." Like, there's a lot more inspection and scrutiny happening, and so just being able to represent upwards. And again, being able to explain, I don't know, I haven't quite figured out how you break down my queuing theory talk for the VP of sales yet, but I think it's somewhere in there is explaining, like, when we, like, there's math that shows that when we do this, we will go fast for a short period of time. And then we will start to hit issues of predictability, wasted work, quality issues, etc. And this is like well proven in the business, and I can point you to this book and this book and this book to explain that to you. But then I also think another really important skill for the CEO is the yes and. So I took 2 improv classes, like, hated them with every ounce of my heart, but they made me a much better public speaker. And being one of the things you learn there is part of improv is to, like, keep the conversation going. And one of the ways to do that is to always have in mind this yes and, like, yes, I want to do that for you, and I would need to set this project aside for 3 months in order to do that. So getting really good at articulating those trade-offs.
Okay, thank you. Very helpful. If you could give CTOs out there 3 tips on like who want to get started with DX and developer productivity, what would you like, apart from like recommending your tool, obviously?
Yeah, of course.
Like tip number 1, but if you could add 2, like what would it be?
Yeah. No, tip number 1 is not to buy our product. Tip number 1 is to talk to your developers. Go watch them work. You may see things that you're like, why are you clicking that button 5 times and waiting 5 minutes every time after you click the button? Like, what's that about? So maybe not the CTO going out, because the CTO is going to bring, executive fear with them, even if they don't intend to. But really, like, the first thing I think you should do is talk to your engineers about what is hard for you, what's getting in your way, what did you experience at your last job that you miss, like what tool did you have that we should consider, or what, like, capability did you have that we should consider, and just starting there and understanding, like, maybe they're really frustrated that priorities are constantly changing, or maybe they're really frustrated that they can't seem to keep their development environment in working order. Those are 2 really different problems, right? And for neither of them do you need a tool to act on those problems. And so I think part of it, especially if you're going to bring in a tool, part of it is showing really early on that feedback loop exists and that it gets acted on. That when you talk to developers and they say, I'm really struggling with maintaining my local development environment, you say, cool, we have a plan for how we're going to address that in the next 6 months by putting development environments in the cloud or something. I don't know. So part of it, that really early activity is just about building trust that you are in this for everyone's benefit. You're not just trying to cut costs and make everybody work at 100% utilization. You're really trying to listen to them and hear what their challenges are. That lets you build the credibility to later bring in a tool and say, all right, we've hit some of the stuff that was really obvious. Now we want to kind of baseline, where are we, and make sure that we don't get that we stay there or get better. And so that's when we're going to bring in a tool. Is we've made some good improvements. Now we want to kind of see where are we as far as DORA type stuff, or where are we as far as a dev survey. And we're going to work on, now we're going to switch to continuous improvement. Instead of picking some very specific things to work on, we're going to switch to continuous improvement, where we're running a developer survey every quarter or every half. And this team is responsible for ingesting the content, the responses from that survey, and then figuring out how they will act on them. I have a blog post about this. I call it the brains framework. So baseline, research, act, invest, normalize, and sustain. But it really is starting with just talking to your developers and gaining that goodwill that you're actually interested in improving things. Because when you improve things, you improve them for the business, but you also improve what it's like to go to work every day. And how many cigarette breaks you have to take or coffee breaks you have to take in order to get through your day waiting for that build. So yeah, I think the first place is not a tool. The first place is simply talking, and then bringing the tool in to make sure that continuous improvement is happening once you've made those first investments.
And a good next step could be basically squad health check, like Spotify model, or
I mean, I think lots of things. And again, it depends. So for a certain, for some companies, they're going to be at a stage where it's you know what? We need a platform team. We need to, these aren't, what we're observing is that these problems aren't local to the teams. These aren't problems of team collaboration. These are systemic problems outside that. So maybe we need to build a platform team that is going to be responsible for all builds. We're not going to make everybody own that on their own and own their own deployment infrastructure. We're going to bring that under a single banner. Or we're not going to make people maintain their own development environments. We're going to have a standard way that you show up on day one, you push a button, and you're off to the races. So I think the step 2 really depends on what you learn in step 1. But I think step 2 really is, it could be that you need a platform team. It could be just that you need better hygiene, just agreement across the business. We want to work the board right to left. As a business, we're going to work the board right to left, and everyone on the team is going to work the board right to left. And that's going to reduce our, cycle time issues, for example. But when it gets into our mean time to recovery varies across different teams, again, that may be a platform problem, or that may be a policy problem. That may be a skills gap, where the skills to do that well don't exist on every team. So again, it really depends. And in some future, my job is just to sit and read survey results and tell you what to do. Read survey results and look at Swarmia dashboards and tell you what to do. But I do think again, I don't know, beyond Swarmia, but it is at some point you're going to need tools to understand, are you sustaining the value that you've created by making these improvements? And one of the terrible things about productivity and effectiveness is that as long as you are writing code, there will always be problems. It used to be, would say, as long as you're hiring people, there will always be problems. But even when we stopped hiring people, we kept writing code, and as there gets to be more and more code, things over time get harder and harder, and the utility that an individual engineer can provide will decrease over time if you aren't tackling that constant increase in complexity.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Really insightful.
Did we talk about anything we said we would? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, a few things, and we did absolutely. And unfortunately, we're already approaching the end.
Yes.
And there's one question
yes.
that I still have in mind, a little surprise for you.
Yes, please.
I don't know if I told you that I actually got to know Otto Hilsker, like your CEO. But I did, and he told me about a little Easter egg in the report you just told me about, like the one where you can see all developers, like every individual one, and we applied that to Swarmia so we can see your seat as well, and now he told me about a little Easter egg that allows you to basically pick a time and actually travel back in time. Like it's a imagine we have a time machine now, and we can go back to the year 2013 when you worked for Bazaar Voice as a staff.
Oh my gosh!
And now imagine you can whisper something into young Rebecca's ears. What would it be?
Oh, yeah, that was the job. That was the job I had. The first job I had where an email went out that like the CTO was leaving. And that was the first job I had where I was like, that's important. Like, that's way disconnected from my life, my day-to-day life. Like, I don't work with a CTO often. Like, that's important that just happened and that means something. And so that was kind of my, I know that sounds really naive now, but I think the advice that I would give to myself is that like engineering is such a small, like writing code every day is such a small slice of what it means to be a business and to be a software engineering business. And in my current job, I get to deal with marketing and sales and customer support and product and all these things. It's fascinating. I did not value any of those functions at all when I was at Bazaar Voice. Sales was the people who just like made my life harder. Right. And so I think looking back, I wish I had appreciated the broader aspects of the business earlier than I did. At the same time, like I'm really enjoying exploring those and understanding and valuing those now. And I have a lot more value to bring from my engineering experience than I would have had in 2013 at Bazaar Voice, like to show up to marketing and be like, hey, I'm a staff engineer. What do I need to know? But yeah, I think overall, I have been one of those people who thought that engineering was exceptional, and that it was somehow different and somehow like leave us alone. We don't, you don't deserve to talk to us, kind of thing.
So you would shout, "Get out of the ivory tower!"
Yes, absolutely. And I think like, yes, so I have really, and I think a lot of people have come to realize that there's a lot more as you rise through the ranks. There's a lot more to building software than writing code. And we would all do well to realize that. And I think as the industry continues to evolve, you're going to see, just like marketing has had to learn how to write HTML and make commits to GitHub, engineering is going to have to start to understand more about sales and more about marketing and more about customer success. And that's my big kind of career takeaway.
We're all becoming more generalistic.
Yeah? Yes.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. It was really fun talking to you. Great.
Such a delight, Toby, again.
And yeah, really fun. So thanks a lot. See you
as always. All right. Take care.
Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to the Alphalist podcast. If you like this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. Alphalist is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to cto@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on Alphalist, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.